I'm John Weber with AM Best. Welcome to our webcast. Best Impairment Study 2018. AM Best analysts will review the results published in Best Impairment Rate and Ratings Transition Study 1977 to 2018. Panelists will review the impairment rates and rating transitions based on both the Financial Strength Rating Scale and on the Long-Term Issuer Credit Rating Scale, most familiar to users of debt market ratings. We're going to be meeting our panelists in just a moment. Now, we will be mentioning the subject of financial strength ratings. A full explanation of AM Best ratings is available online at ambest.com/terms. Now, if you have a question or comment, you can send it in to us at webinars@ambest.com, and we're going to do our best to recognize it during our presentation today. And now let's meet our presenters. Presenting today will be Emmanuel Madu. Manny's the Managing Director at AM Best, and also Michael Porcelli. Michael's Director at AM Best. And at this time, we're going to turn things over to Manny Madu. Manny?
Thanks, John. Let's begin by discussing the agenda items for today. We'll begin by talking about the scope and methodology of the study, then move on to the review the 2018 study results based on financial strength ratings, and then talk about the results based on issuer credit ratings. And finally, we'll talk about the comparability of our impairment rates to the default studies across rating agencies. First, with the scope of the impairment study. This is our 16th impairment study, and this particular study covers the years 1977 to 2018. The study was published on June 12, 2019. And this study covers impairments associated with U.S. property and casualty and life health insurers that have traditionally filed statutory statements. The study involves ratings performance data associated with 5,250 operating insurers that had at least one AM Best financial strength ratings between 1977 and 2018. It also includes 3,367 operating insurers with assigned or implied AM Best issuer credit ratings from 2001 to 2018. As John mentioned, the ICR scale is a scale most familiar to users of debt capital markets ratings. The study uses AM Best definition of financial impairment as of December 31, 2018. Most of you know that the financial health of insurance companies are monitored by state regulators, and U.S. insurance companies are not subject to the federal bankruptcy laws. AM Best has designated an insurer as a financially impaired company upon the first official regulatory action taken by state insurance regulators. The state actions could encompass a whole host of actions. The most severe actions are probably conservation, rehabilitation, and liquidations. These three actions are done under court orders, and they're considered receiverships. As I mentioned, receiverships actually encompass three types of state actions. Conservation allows time to assess the nature of the insurer's financial condition, and typically the regulator decides within months if to move the rehabilitation to a liquidation phase. And a confidentiality is sometimes imposed at this stage. And incidentally, the receiver for impaired insurers, usually the state commissioner, the insurance commissioner of a state. Rehabilitation is akin to a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And in rehab, a regulator conducts the business of the insurer and formulates a plan to remove the causes of the conditions that cause the rehabilitation order. And in case there's no resolution to the rehabilitation process, the next stage is liquidation. In liquidation, a regulator can close the insurance company, cancel policies or transfer policies to solvent insurers, and also sell the company assets to pay off the company's insurance claims and debt obligations. State guarantee funds are typically involved at this stage. AM Best has three ratings performance measures: gross impairments, net impairments, and liquidations. I'll now go through each one. Gross impairments encompass the broadest definition of impairments. It includes receivership, which, as I mentioned earlier, which includes conservation, rehabilitation, liquidations. But it also includes administrative orders and other regulatory actions that may not give rise to actual losses to policyholders or contract holders. For gross impairments, impairments are counted even if an insurer has withdrawn from the rating process. So in this year's impairment list, there are 3 companies. One of the companies had not been rated by AM Best since 2001, yet we count that in the gross impairment count. There are about 777 insurers put into the gross impairment category. Out of those, about 230 actually had not been rated by AM Best, sometimes for quite some time. Net impairment represents gross impairments, except that insurers that became impaired after ratings withdrawals are not counted. This measure is more consistent with the calculations used by other credit rating agencies in their corporate default studies. There are 549 insurers put into the net impairment category, compared to the 777 gross impairments. Liquidations represent insurers counted in the net impairments category that were eventually liquidated. It's probably a good measure as to which impaired companies are more likely to give rise to losses on insurance policies and contract obligations. There are about 364 companies that were liquidated out of the 777 gross impairments and 549 net impairments. AM Best uses the static pool approach to calculate impairment and liquidation rates. Static pool approach is defined as a cohort of insurers with AM Best ratings. We have 42 static pools, which are formed between 1977 and 2018. So for each static pool of rated insurers, we actually observed the number of companies that became impaired over a predetermined calculation period, such as 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. All the impairments are then summed up and divided by the total number of companies in static pools using the calculations. I'll give an example on the next slide. Let's look at how we actually calculate the 5-year impairment rates. Our data set goes from 1977 to 2018. So we begin with the 1977 static pool, and we observe what happened to those companies in 1982, which is 5 years later. We then move on to the 1978 static pool and observe what happened to those companies in 1983. We do that all the way up to the last static pool for the 5-year impairment rate calculation of 2013 and observe what happens to those companies in 2018. We sum up all those impairments and then divide it by the number of insurers in the 37 pairs of static pools in the calculation. And we do that for every single different rating levels. And based on that, we get the 5-year impairment rate. I'm now going to turn the study over to Michael, who's going to discuss the results of the study based on financial strength ratings and issuer credit ratings.
So thank you, Manny. I'll be working us through the next 2 sections of the presentation. We're going to be starting with the financial strength rating results. So in 2018, there were 3 insurers that were rated by AM Best that became impaired in 2018. Those 3 listed here: Merced Property and Casualty Company of California. That was a result of the California wildfires of 2018. There were 2 others that were auto insurers: Paramount Insurance Company of Maryland and Access Insurance Company of Texas. As Manny had mentioned before, this was one that had a rating withdrawal in the year of 2001, but is included in our gross impairment measure. The next chart actually shows impairments by year since 1977. So for the period from 1978 to 2003, there were 658 gross impairments over that 26-year period. That resulted in 25.3 impairments per year. For the period after that, from 2004 to 2018, that 15-year period, we found that there were 119 gross impairments. That resulted in 7.9 impairments per year. So you could see that impairments were noticeably higher from years 1978 to 2003. In fact, they were higher at a rate of 3 times that of 2004 to 2018 annually. So what were the factors that contributed to this? Well, for life and health insurers before 2004, we noticed heightened stock and bond market volatility, product competition that added increased balance sheet risk beyond traditional life insurance products, the introduction of institutional products with short-term put options, an increase in credit risk in the investment portfolios of life and health insurers, and financial deregulation that resulted in disintermediation from other financial institutions. We noted three very significant impairments that occurred before 2004, the first of which was 1991's executive life, which was a result of the collapse of the high yield market. Also in 1991, mutual benefit life became impaired. That was related to their investment portfolio, but it was real estate losses. And then in 1999, the impairment of General American, which was related to liquidity problems due to optionality and short-term funding agreements. Turning our focus to property and casualty insurers before 2004, we note there were costly natural and man-made catastrophes, an extreme interest rate environment, and profitability pressures from a variety of factors, which include reserve deficiencies, increased litigation, inflationary pressures, environmental liabilities, and global competition. We've identified a few of the companies that were impaired before 2004. 1992 had a significant event in Hurricane Andrew. We have a partial list of those companies that were included in our impairment tally. First, Southern Insurance Company, Florida Fire and Casualty Insurance Company, Great Republic Insurance Company, MCA Insurance Company, and Regency Insurance Company. This represents about half of the companies that actually became impaired as a result of Hurricane Andrew. Also in 2001, we saw a couple companies that had deficient loss reserves and inadequate pricing. So notably Reliance Insurance Company and Frontier Insurance Company. Moving to the numbers that and charts that you can find in the impairment study, the study covers the period from 1977 to 2018. There were 5,250 insurers that were covered, and the gross impairment total during that period was 777 insurers. The data represents averages over various measurement periods and shows that impairments rates generally increase over time and increase as ratings degrade. So if you take a look at our red box here, if you move from left to right, you'll see that the impairment rates increase as expected as we increase the measurement period from 1 year to 15 years. And if you also look at the red box that is vertical at the 10-year mark there, you will see, as expected, that impairment rates increase as you move down the rating scale. This is a graphic representation of the previous chart. What you'll notice here is that the lines here monotonically non-decrease with higher impairments over time and higher impairments with lower rates. There could be some data inconsistencies due to areas where there's sparse data. For example, you'll see where the lines cross over in the 3-year observation period in the C++, C+ range. But for the most part, there's an expected result here. Okay, now if you do a comparison between gross impairments, net impairments, and liquidation rates, you'll actually see that the gross impairments are the more conservative measure. We highlight here the A- rating for the 10-year measurement period. You'll see that, as expected, gross impairments are higher than net impairments, which are higher than the liquidation rates. Our total gross impairments in the study were 777. Our net impairments were 549, and there were 364 liquidations. This next slide highlights the relationship between gross impairments and net impairments and shows that gross impairments were 1.4 times that of net impairments for the 10-year measurement period at the A- level, and gross impairments were 2.7 times the liquidation rate. Okay, the next thing we show here are the rating transition matrices on an FSR basis. This is one particular matrix that was included in the study. It's for the 1-year measurement period and covers averages from 1977 to 2018. Over the long term, high rating stability is generally consistent with higher ratings, except for rating categories where there are sparse ratings data. You'll also note that in our study, we publish rating matrices for 1-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, and 15-year measurement periods. We also include them on a net basis and on a liquidation basis. But in the interest of time, we're just showing the one matrix here. I draw your attention to the report so you can see the other matrices. In addition, we calculate every measurement period from 1 to 15 years, but only publish the selected matrices that I mentioned. Okay, so this table shows the rating categories of impaired insurers by years before impairment. So highly rated insurers, B+ and above, generally migrate to lower ratings as impairment approaches. So you see the observable pattern here. There are 152 A/A- rated carriers 5 years before impairment, but only 70 1 year before impairment. As you move down the rows in this table, you'll notice that the number of insurers rated B+ 1 year before impairment is higher than the number 5 years before impairment. For example, if you were to take a look at the C++/C+ range, you'll see 61 insurers 1 year before impairment and 34 5 years before. Okay. This table shows the average number of years to impairment based on various rating categories. The average years to impairment from initial rating date generally decreases as ratings decrease. So looking at the top of the chart here, it took an average of 16.6 years for gross impaired insurers initially rated A++/A+ to become impaired. As you move down to the bottom, it took an average of 10 years for gross impaired insurers initially rated D to become impaired. Now I'm going to move us to the next section, and that is our impairments on an issuer credit ratings basis. So the ICR is a 21-point scale. It's an opinion regarding the relative future credit risk of an entity. We adopted the ICR rating scale in 2001. So operating company ICRs are the foundation for the operating company FSR, starting in 2001. And since 2001, the operating company FSR has been determined by using the rating translation table, which I'll show on the next slide. And in the early days of adoption of ICRs, insurers that had FSRs but not ICRs were assigned a proxy ICR for the purposes of this study. So here's the rating translation table that I just referenced. It can be found in Best Credit Rating Methodology document. And so the results of the impairment study will start with the gross impairments on an ICR basis, and this includes all symbols and notches from AAA down to CCC. As expected, you have the same pattern here moving from left to right, and we also cut off the data at 10 years instead of 15 as we did for FSRs due to the shorter time frame of the ICR, of using ICRs. We also compressed the data, so removing the notches and just using the symbols AAA, AA, single A, etc. And you will see that as you move from left to right, you will see impairments increase as the measurement period increases, and also moving from top to bottom as you move down the rating scale, the impairment rate increases. For ICRs, we had 3,367 insurers rated in that period, and we found that the gross impairments were 167 insurers. Our study also presents the same on a net impairment basis, so this should be a familiar chart, only the data is based on net impairments. The same pattern moving from left to right and from top to bottom also. And then we compress the data for our rating symbols on an ICR basis. There were 128 net impairments using the same number of insurers and the definitions that Manny had already described. Finally, we present our results on a liquidation basis. And what you'll see here is, as before, moving from left to right, the impairment rate generally decreases, and moving from top to bottom, increases. Moving from top to bottom, the impairment rate also increases. And once again, here we are using the rating symbols AAA, AA, single A, etc. We have 76 liquidations. So now let's put the three of them side by side, our final slide in this section. And you can see that the gross impairment measure is the most conservative of the three, followed by net impairments, and then again liquidations, so as before. This is for the 10-year measurement period, so it covers 8 10-year periods from 2001 to 2018. And now with that, I'll turn it back over to Manny.
Thanks. So I'll now talk about how to compare AM Best impairment rates, the default rates of other CRAs in their studies. First, other CRAs produce corporate default studies, and I've listed them here. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch ratings. Default studies are listed on this slide. And they generally produce their studies by the first half of the year. Of course, our study was just published a few days ago. Some of the important issues to consider when you're comparing AM Best impairment studies to default studies of other rating agencies is that you have to make sure you're comparing similar obligations. Are you comparing debt ratings to debt ratings and insurance company ratings to insurance company ratings? You also must make sure that you're comparing similar sectors. You should probably be comparing insurance company ratings to insurance company ratings or utilities to utilities. So it's important to make sure the sectors are the same. Also, you have to consider the fact that there's some limits on data credibility. If you don't rate enough insurance companies, the results of your data may not really give you any deeper insight into the efficacy of your ratings. Corporate issue default studies of major CRAs are based on issuer ratings. And they call these issuer ratings, given many different names. For example, for S&P study, they use long-term issuer credit ratings in their studies. For Moody's, they use the ratings of corporate bond, loans, and depositor issuers. For Fitch, they use the issuer default ratings. To simplify matters, we call all of these collectively issuer ratings. You should know that the default rates associated with these issuer ratings really reflect default rates of senior unsecured debt obligations or their proxies, for the most part. So the issuer ratings of these major CRAs can be equated to AM Best holding company ICRs because the holding company ICRs by AM Best is effectively equivalent to senior unsecured debt ratings. So you got to make these comparisons. The comparison has to be between issuer ratings of major CRAs and AM Best holding company ICRs. Now, AM Best impairment study is based on operating insurance companies for the most part. So we look at the ratings of long-term issuer credit ratings at the operating company level. To simplify matters, we call these operating company issuer credit ratings, or ICRs. So we calculate impairment rates related to defaults on insurance policy or contract obligations, effectively, in our studies. So we found that users of our ratings sometimes make a comparison between impairment rate of AM Best operating company ICRs to the default rates of other credit rating agencies' issuer ratings. Of course, this is incorrect because you're comparing insurance company ratings to debt ratings. In order to make this kind of comparison, you have to convert AM Best operating company ICRs to equivalent issuer ratings of the other rating agencies. And the way you do that is through our notching process. So we notch down from nearly all our operating ICRs to holding companies. And in general, and that's because the reason you notch down is because in general the source of strength of the holding company is the operating company. And also policyholders of the operating company have seniority over creditors of the holding company. And regulators can restrict cash flows from operating companies to holding companies. So for the most part, the rating of the holding company will be lower than the rating of the operating company. Okay, this notching scheme is shown on this slide. You can see in the box below, you have operating company ICRs in the first column. And to get to the holding company ICR, you have to go through a notching process, as I mentioned earlier in the prior slide. And for the most part, where it really counts, the notching scheme actually is the 3 notches between the operating company ICR and the holding company ICR. So for example, if the operating company ICR is A minus, the holding company ICR would be triple B minus, which is a 3-notch down. So this is how you convert operating company ICRs to holding company ICRs, and we do that for our entire data set. Here's some examples of actual ratings that we have out there. It'll show you the notching process and show you how we apply it. So for all these companies, let's pick one of them, Selective Insurance Group, Inc., which is the last one. The long-term ICR, which is the operating company ICR, is A+. So to get to the actual debt rating, we do notch down. To get to the long-term ICR, which is the holding company ICR, we notch down, go down 3 notches to get to the triple B plus rating. This rating is actually also equivalent to the long-term issue credit rating, which is effectively the senior unsecured debt rating. So for companies that issue debt that we rate, we go through this process. But of course, we don't. A lot of insurance companies do not issue debt, so you have to get implied long-term issue credit ratings for those companies. So the appropriate comparison of obligations must be that we compare the impairment rates of AM Best holding company ICRs to the default rates of other CRA's issuer ratings. This is the appropriate comparison. When you do that, you get these comparisons across credit rating agencies. So I've gone to the reports of all the other rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. I've pulled their 10-year average cumulative default rates from their latest studies, and I've kind of juxtaposed it to the AM Best holding company issuer credit ratings, default rates, implied impairment rates of the holding companies. And so this is the proper comparison to make. You can find these numbers in the studies of the other rating agencies. Notice that you have some counterintuitive results here. You have sparse data, and because of that, you have some inconsistencies, and it's across the board, really. All the rating agencies have the same problem, where because the data is sparse, you don't get consistent defaults as you go from the highest rating to the lowest rating. And I've circled some of the problematic areas. So this is not peculiar to any particular rating agency. It's really a function of the fact that defaults are rare events, and also there are very few ratings in the extreme ends of the rating scale. This looks a bit better when you compress the ratings by rating symbols. So you have the main rating categories, AAA all the way to CCC. When you compress it, you'll see that the data is more consistent. So you generally, nearly for all the rating agencies generally, you have defaults or impairments increasing from highest ratings to the lowest ratings. And this makes sense. And so you can see that you make this comparison. You compare numbers of S&P, Moody's, and Fitch to AM Best. AM Best numbers looks quite low. So is this a fair comparison? If we're being intellectually honest, it's not a fair comparison because AM Best data set is purely insurance, and it's well recognized that different industries and sectors can produce different default or impairment rates. There are generally 5 broad classes of credit ratings as identified by the SEC. You have financial institutions, brokers or dealers. We'll call those financial institutions. Insurance companies, corporate issuers, issuers of structured finance products, and issuers of government securities, municipal securities, or securities issued by a foreign government. These generally tend to have different default impairment characteristics. Default studies conducted by the other rating agencies generally includes three of the 5 categories: financial institutions, corporate issuers, and insurance companies. Although I note that these studies include a very little insurance data. So effectively, their default studies really reflect defaults on debt obligations of financial institutions and corporate issuers. So it isn't a fair comparison to compare AM Best data to their data, because our data is a narrow slice of it's just the insurance industry data. So for a truly apples-to-apples comparison, insurance data should be pulled out from the default studies of the other CRAs and compared to the data from AM Best. The problem with this is that you have issues of data credibility. The other rating agencies may not have the same number of insurance companies that we do, so that may not be a fair comparison either. And you can see on this table shows, I pulled this data from the submissions by the other rating agencies to the SEC. It's called the Exhibit 1 submission, and in that submission it shows the insurance companies rated by the different rating agencies. And I pulled, this is the latest data from 2018 submission. It's actually the 2008 cohort that I used here, because a lot of these impairment studies really are over a decade, so it doesn't make sense to use the latest cohort of insurance companies. So this is a 2008 cohort. You can see that there are many different, there's kind of a disparate number of companies by the different rating agencies, as you can see there. And the smaller agencies have even smaller number of insurance companies. So you have to question whether you can actually rely fully on the data set where the number of insurance companies is quite small. So this is an issue that has to be grappled with when you're comparing across rating agencies, impairment study and default study of rating agencies. So other issues that may affect the comparability of default and impairment studies include definition of default or impairments, treatment of rating withdrawals, the number of economic cycles that are covered by the study period, and also the catalog of natural catastrophe events of the study period. So all these things must be considered when making such comparisons across rating agencies. And with that, I believe that's the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Manny and Michael, for a very informative presentation there. We do not have any questions, so we will just let our registrants know that we'll have a full replay of this webinar up within the next day or so. We'll have a transcript out within the next week or so. For AM Best, I'm John Weber.